Hello, thank you very much for being back promptly. Let's start. We have now proceeding with the last session of today, and we are delighted to have with us Jesús Fernández-Villaverde with a keynote presentation. Over the last 25 or maybe 30 years, Jesús just was telling me that he actually started out as a lawyer before going to do a PhD in economics. Jesús has truly worked on the breadth of topics inside and outside of economics, and has acquired a truly broad perspective on things. Now at the University of Pennsylvania, National Bureau of Economic Research and Center of Economic Policy Research. And it's a fantastic topic, the title for the speech, The Future of Humanity. And then there is some small print about demographics, facts and consequences. So we will listen to the future of humanity for about 45 minutes or so, and then questions are very welcome after that. Thank you.
There is some substance to the bravado of the title. The global fertility crisis is worse than you think. 2023 was probably the first year in human history when our fertility rate fall below the replacement rate. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about this in just 1 second. But it means that for the very, very first time ever in our history as a species, not even when there were wars or pandemics, we are not having enough children to replicate ourselves. Now, there is something called momentum, which basically means that right now, a lot of the women who were born in the early 1990s and late 1990s, where the cohorts of births were very large, are having their children, but their grandparents haven't died yet, and that's why the world population is still increasing. This will eventually turn out some moment, I will say, given the current observations, around 2055. So 2055 will be the year of peak humanity in size, and we will start going down. Peak births, which was the year where the most children were ever born, was probably around 2013, and births are already falling at the world level since then. And what I try to argue here is that the consequences for the world are momentous. I could talk about this easily for 10 hours non-stop, but I have promised Alexander I will only talk for 45. So I will be selective and telling you just a few of those. So a few definitions. These things, we talk about them all the time, but I have realized that a lot of economists sometimes are a little bit fussy about the details. So first of all, what is the total fertility rate of a population? It's the average number of children that will be born to a woman over her lifetime if, let me say first the second one, she were to live between 15 to 54, which is 44, excuse me, which is considered the normal fertility age. And second, and this is more important, if she were to experience the current age-specific fertility rates. This is different from completed fertility that we saw today in some of the presentations. That is the number of children that a woman actually had at the end of her life. So think about the total fertility rate of the number of children of this synthetic woman. Now, why do we care about total fertility rate? Because it governs whether or not a population is above or below replacement rate. That is, whether or not at the current number of births we are going to grow in the long run or we are going to go down. But remember what I was mentioning before about momentum. Even if total fertility rate is below replacement rate, it will take a little bit of time before population starts shrinking. Well, the first thing I want to tell you is that the world decrease in total fertility rate is everywhere. And the first thing I'm always asked when I talk with the media, I give a lot of interviews about this thing, is, oh, but you are worried about the US, or you are worried about the United Kingdom, or you are worried about some other rich economy. And I show them this table, and they are quite amazed. I have picked the US as an example of a rich advanced economy, total fertility rate 1.6. Tunisia, 1.56. Mexico, 1.55. In the US, they are really impressed when I tell them that, when I tell them that Mexico has lower fertility than the US. Turkey, 1.48. Brazil, 1.47. Iran, 1.44. Notice, for instance, that I'm picking Tunisia, Turkey, and Iran, 3 countries of Muslim majority, because again, a lot of people have the idea that this may not be something that is also happening in countries in the Muslim world. Sri Lanka, 1.37. Bosnia and Herzegovina, 1.2. Colombia, 1.06. To put it in perspective, Spain, which is the largest country, is the country within the European Union with the lowest fertility, except for Malta, is 1.12. So at this moment, Colombia has a lower fertility rate than Spain, than Italy, and than Japan. And Colombia is a middle-income economy. Thailand, 0.98. This is quite amazing. And I could give you dozens and dozens of other examples. So why do we care about these numbers? I told you before, because they govern whether or not we are above or below the replacement rate. What is the replacement rate? Well, it turns out to be the case that a lot of you probably think this is a constant, like the gravitational constant. It's actually a little bit more subtle. It happens to be determined by a fraction. In the numerator, we have 1 plus the sex ratio at birth, which in natural situations is around 1.05. That basically means that for every 100 girls, there are 105 boys born under no outside intervention. And then you divide by the probability that a woman will survive to 30, because this is the midpoint between 14 and 45. Now, you could do like the whole integral and do it carefully, but in practice, the approximation is nearly perfect. So you have probably read dozens of times that replacement rate is 2.1, which is true for the US, because in the US, the sex ratio at birth is indeed 1.05 plus 1, you get 2.05, and you divide by the probability that a woman will survive to 30, which is 0.98, and you have 2.1. So 2.1, because you need 2.1 humans to be born, out of which around 1.07 will be boys, 1.03 will be girls, and of those 1.03, 1 will get to 30 and reproduce. But it turns out to be the case that this is not true for many other countries in the world. First of all, because the sex ratio at birth is very different from 1.05. In this graph, I have shown you countries that are roughly at 1.05, maybe a little bit lower, maybe a little bit higher. There's always a little bit of a statistical variation. And what you will realize is that a lot of very important countries are not at 1.05. So China is 1.15, India is 1.10, basically selective abortions against girls since the introduction of ultrasound scanning. But countries that are within your purview, Azerbaijan, Georgia, Armenia, Albania. The second point that is important is if you're in Pakistan, unfortunately, there is high youth mortality. So only around 90% of women actually do survive to 30. That basically tells you that the replacement rate for Pakistan is not 2.1, it's 2.33. And when you do these numbers for the whole planet, and it's a little bit difficult because, as I will tell you in a second, the data is actually not extremely reliable, but I think that a benchmark for me is that the world replacement level is 2.2. Okay? Doesn't sound to be much higher than 2.1, but you will see in a second, it actually does make a difference. Okay, so this is the total fertility rate for the planet as assumed or calculated by the United Nations in its different world population projections. There is a new projection every 2 years. And you can see that, in fact, in the 1950s and 1960s, the total fertility rate was 5. Very, very high. This was the moment where people were writing books about the population bomb, the population explosion. We need to do something about it. But nearly as soon as those books were published, you start seeing a very, very fast drop in total fertility rate. The drop in total fertility rate slowed down a little bit in the early 2000s, and then seems to have accelerated again around 2014. Let me show you this very same graph, but just focusing between 2010 and 2020. And the different lines are the different revisions of the world population projections. And you can see how by now the projection of the United Nations is much lower in the evolution of fertility than it was before. It also assumes that fertility was a little bit higher at the beginning of the sample, but now is much, much lower. Okay? So in fact, according to the United Nations, in 2024, we are 2.23. And remember, replacement rate for the planet is 2.2. So according to the United Nations, we are marginally above replacement rate. But what is the interesting thing? I will come back to that in a second. But just using the United Nations data, this graph is similar to one of the graphs we saw this morning. Is in blue, countries below replacement rate. In red, countries above replacement rate. What do you see over there? Pretty much the whole of the Americas is blue. All of Europe is blue. Most of Asia is blue. Even a substantial part of the Middle East is blue. Now really is Africa and Central Asia that is red. But I'm going to try to convince you that this is actually a surprisingly optimistic view of the situation. A lot of the countries in this graph that are red should in fact be blue. So there is much more blue in this graph than what you think it is. So I have a great pre-doc working for me, with me, Patrick Norrick. And what we have done is we have looked at the world population prospect. And I'm sorry to tell you, it doesn't make any sense to us. Now, I'm happy to be corrected. We are going to write a paper on it. And maybe, we will give the demographers of the United Nations the chance to reply and respond to us. And I actually think I have a political economy reason of why the numbers of the United Nations do not make any sense, but they really don't make any sense. And let me tell you a few examples. First of all, there is a huge discrepancy between the vital registries. Think about the civil registry in countries where you go and write down how many people are being born and how many people are dying, and what the United Nations claims are the births in this country. And this is even true for countries that the United Nations itself assesses as having complete vital statistics. Okay, so either one or the other. You cannot defend both positions in the same report. Give me my favorite case, Colombia. I'm going to focus on Colombia. Well, it happens to be the case that one of the postdocs working with me is from Colombia, and we have actually talked with the people at DANE, at the statistical agency in Colombia. We have sit down with them, and we have really say, are your vital statistics complete? And they promised me, over the memory of their ancestors that yes, that they may miss some kid in the middle of the jungle, but that these are 99.9% accurate. And what you see over there is gigantic, but absolutely gigantic differences in the number of births between what the Colombian authorities claim is happening in Colombia. And remember, this is not Colombians. These are people born in Colombia. Okay, so that includes Venezuelan immigrants and the numbers that the United Nations claim are born in Colombia. Huge differences, and if you actually forecast, you actually get 2024, the numbers are even bigger. It's just Colombia? No, Turkey. Huge differences in Turkey between what the Turkish authorities tell me and what the United Nations say. Egypt. Again, a country that, remember, the United Nations itself claims has reliable vital statistics. We are talking now here about more than 500,000 people difference in any given year. These are huge differences. If you look at numbers in Egypt for 2024, Egyptian authorities claim that there are less than 2 million births in Egypt in 2024. The United Nations doesn't get to that level even at the end of the forecast period, which is 2100. And what does this matter? Because differences in number of births have huge consequences, of course, for the level of population. And one thing I love to explain to people is what I have called the rule of 85. So you want to know what is the long-run population that a country that has a life expectancy of around 85 years, which is South Korea or Spain or Japan, the countries with the highest life expectancy right now in the world will be? Well, you just look at the number of births and multiply by 85. And that kind of gives you the long-run population, given that the number of total births will be roughly the same as today. And if, for instance, you look at the population in Colombia, they had 445,000 births in 2024, which implies that the long-run population in Colombia, of course, all of this is net of any type of migration, will be a little bit less than 38 million. The current population is 50 million. The United Nations assumes that there will be around 60 million. Okay, so we are talking here about huge, huge differences. And when you start putting those together, they start to add up. In blue over there, or green, you see the projection for the United Nations. The United Nations thinks that peak humanity, the peak of human population, will be the year 2084. But even just correcting for things like Egypt or Colombia really pushes that back a lot. And this is very important because we are trying to forecast the peak of a concave curve. Even relatively small differences means that the forecast will push ahead a lot. And that's why I think the peak will be around 2055 and not around 2085. Second thing that really makes me very, very suspicious about the numbers of the United Nations and how everyone is using them for a lot of things is the odd forecast. Okay, continuous line over here is what we have observed. This continuous line is the forecast of the United Nations. So the US goes down, goes down, goes down, goes down, and then magically it stops. Okay, maybe. South Korea is even better. Okay, imagine that this is a roadshow and, you're trying to fund some project in some of the countries that you lend to, and, whoever is trying to sell you the project is saying, this is the evolution of my revenue, but as soon as, we start tomorrow, that will be the evolution starting tomorrow. Remember, these are the forecasts that enter into what the United Nations is forecasting. It will happen with world population. China. India, going down, going down, going down, and then it stops. Chile. And again, we already have observations for Chile for 2024, continues going down. Okay? So what is going on? If this was a little bit of a time series econometrics, my dean is under the impression that I actually do time series, is that the United Nations is using something called a Bayesian hierarchical model that has an enormous reversion to the mean. And no matter you continue going down, the darn thing wants to go up. And then you need to justify it. So this is what they write. The rebound in future fertility for low fertility countries is consistent with an expectation of continued progress toward gender equality and women empowerment and improving social and economic opportunities for young people and families. How many martinis do you need to have before you can actually write that? I will say 3. Okay? There is a little bit more of a subtle point over here, which is the difference between conditional and unconditional forecast. Okay? And this is something very important. Now, it may be the case that it's a rebound if people start getting very, very worried about the evolution of fertility, and then there's a lot of pronatalist policies. Whether or not they work, we already talked about that this morning with things like housing, but let's imagine that you say, no, I'm going to consider already that policies are going to change. But if you are just doing unconditional forecasting, I think this is not very serious. Okay? And if you are doing conditional forecasting, at least you need to tell me what type of conditional forecasting are you making and what are the assumptions. And this cannot be cooked up just because you are using a Bayesian hierarchical model with reversion to the mean. Is this solved? No. They are really bizarre numbers. My favorite one is that there is net migration into Earth. So if you actually sum all the migrants that the United Nations considers, now it's not a lot, it's around 5,000 migrants a year, but it really tells me that the United Nations knows something about black men that I don't. Black Men, the movie. Oh, no, Men in Black, sorry, I was translating from Spanish, Men in Black. And of course, the final thing that doesn't make any sense to us whatsoever is what I'm calling the level effects. So I really think there is fewer people in the planet that we believe. And what do I mean by that? I think that statistical agencies have overestimated in the past the number of births, that there were not that many people living around. I actually think they have also underestimated the number of births. So over the last couple of years, I put over there 2 countries, Brazil and Paraguay, but the numbers for Chile just came out a couple of months ago. Brazil, Paraguay, and Chile have undertaken very well-designed and extremely careful censuses. Okay, this has been done with European Union money. It has, crossed all the T's and dot all the I's of doing things carefully and really trying to sample everyone, even if they live in the streets, even if they don't want to answer to the census person. Brazil Turns out to be the case, there is 9 million Brazilians less than we thought. Okay, that's interesting. It's not a lot from the world perspective, but it tells me that, you know, if kind of similar results applies out there, there may be 5% fewer of us than we thought. In Paraguay, it's 6.1 million instead of 6.9. In Chile was 18 point something instead of 19 point something. Okay, so there seem to be a lot of countries where there is actually fewer people. Now, I suspect that this will be the case in many other countries, in particular in Africa. There has been 2 papers today about sub-Saharan Africa. I want to be very open about this. I may be wrong. My reading of the data is that a lot of what we think we know about Africa is probably not true, and that a lot of the statements we are making, with micro statements, I don't have any problems, but with macro statements, I'm a little bit more nervous. And basically what the United Nations is doing is the following. In 1995, they forecasted that there were going to be this many births in Nigeria in 2005. So they just think that the population in Nigeria is whatever they forecasted in 1995 it was going to be. When I actually look at some countries for which there is a little bit of better data, things do not make a lot of sense with respect to the United Nations. I already mentioned Egypt. Just to give you an idea of how fundamental the transformation in Egypt has been. In 2014, Egypt total fertility rate was 3.5. In 2024, it was 2.41. So it has gone down 1.1, nearly 1.1 in just 10 years. That's a tremendous, incredible drop. At the current speed, Egypt will be at 2.1, and remember my point about replacement rates being endogenous, but just set up 2.1 so I don't oversell my case. At the current speed, Egypt may be below replacement rate around 2027, 2028, which is a complete game changer. I don't think anyone in Egypt is even thinking about this at this moment. Tunisia, I already showed you, 1.56, falling down a lot. Something I have looked because it affects a lot the politics of my own country, Spain. Morocco is already below 2.0. Now, Lesotho. Why do I show Lesotho? It's a relatively small country, but interestingly enough, it's a country for which we have relatively better data than for other sub-Saharan countries. And actually, the United Nations uses Lesotho to calibrate a lot their computations for total fertility rates. Turns out to be the case, there is a good chance that Lesotho is already below replacement rate. It's not below 2.1, but it may be below 2.2, 2.3. Okay, and again, that's a game changer. We mentioned before Kenya, and again, I don't have anything to say about the micro work over there about Kenya, but Kenya has a relatively good survey at the national level that has sub-regional data, and I think that Nairobi, the metropolitan area of Nairobi, is already below replacement rate. Now, this is probably not true yet in West Africa, places like Nigeria, Burkina Faso, we talked this morning, etc. I think that over there fertility is very high, but I think it's falling really, really fast. I was actually talking with a PhD student very recently. He's from Ghana, and when I told him this, he said, of course, this is so true. No one in my village is having kids anymore. Now, no one in my village is having kids anymore. He probably doesn't mean that, you know, this is Manhattan where people only have cats. He probably means that people are having 2 kids and not 7 like before, okay? So things can be very, very different. And in fact, this is so much so that just correcting for the effect of Brazil, that the fact that Brazil is 2003 million and not 213, the peak population for the United Nations will be around 2080 and not 2084. Okay, so any type of small corrections you do to the levels will make a big difference. And remember, as I was mentioning before, we are trying to forecast a concave function, which is inherently difficult. Anyway, so correcting for these excess births and for this level effect, what we, Patrick and I, find is that the world total fertility rate in 2024 is likely to be 2.17. Okay, look, I don't have perfect data, so this has some uncertainty, okay? But I really think that if I were a betting man and I had to bet on some particular number, it will be 2.17 instead of 2.23, 24 that the United Nations is saying. And since the world fertility rate is 2.2, that's what I claim at the beginning of my presentation, that humanity is below replacement rate, okay? And, you know, to me, this is absolutely fundamental. Look, we can play a little bit with the numbers at the margin, okay? You can say maybe, Jesús, the replacement rate is not 2.2, it may be already 2.18 because infant mortality is improving in a lot of Africa, fine. Maybe I'm a little bit mismeasuring a couple of countries, fine. But really, given what we are observing and given the speed at which fertility is falling everywhere, And remember, fertility is falling everywhere, in rich countries and in poor countries, in secular countries and in religious countries, in countries where economy is booming and in countries where economy is stagnating. If we were not there in 2023, we will be there in 2025. It doesn't really matter. And of course, again, things can change and they can really change very fast. And we know that in the future, that has happened in the past, but as 2025, we will probably reach the peak of population. And this will have good consequences and this will have bad consequences, okay? Like always in economics, there are going to be trade-offs, and it's neither the end of humanity as we know it, but it's neither going to be that we will march into some utopia of happiness. And in fact, what I always try to highlight is that which of these two effects will predominate, either the positive or the negative, will be to a very large extent the consequence of how seriously we take this consideration and how we respond in terms of policy. But now, please, we are moving into terra incognita. And what does this mean? Things can change. Things can change, and, maybe I got this completely wrong. If you pick any standard social science textbook from the 1980s or even the 1990s, you are going to find the following. So this is the famous book by Paul Ehrlich, The Population Boom. Let me tell you what the book is about. Basically, the book says, population growth is out of control. This is going to be the end of humanity. The book is actually quite bad, even from the perspective of 1968, because he can never. It's actually quite shocking that this became a world bestseller, because he always confuses crude birth rates with total fertility rates, but nonetheless. And another book, which perhaps is a little bit less famous, but quite interesting, was by William and Paul Paddock, Famine 1975, America's Decision, Who Will Survive? So the argument of this book was that the world population was growing so fast and racing ahead of food resources that the only country that was going to have sufficient food surplus in 1975 will be the US. And the US will need to make a triage decision and figure it out which countries need to get food or will deserve to get food and which ones will not. And basically their main policy recommendation is to write India off. The point was India's growth was so out of control that India, it may be better for the world if they just all of them perish. And what I always remind people is, as 2024, India's replacement is well below replacement rate. It's probably around 1.9. In the south states like Kerala, it's actually lower than in the United Kingdom right now. And India right now is a surplus producer of food. It exports more food than it imports. So there is a very good chance that someone will be making fun of me in 25 years if this video is recorded and saying, that idiot Fernández-Villaverde who couldn't see how things will change. Just as a small anecdote, if anyone ever asked me why, when people ask me how you get into this thing, when I was a very, very small kid, my parents bought me this book about countries of the world. It was a beautiful book full of beautiful illustrations and maps and photographs. And one that fascinated me was Mauritius, because it was this small island that has so much diversity of flora and fauna. But the book explained that because population growth in Mauritius was so out of control, the island was doomed. And I remember it really depressed me and made me start thinking about population. Turns out to be the case that Mauritius already has had negative population growth for a couple of years, even forgetting about migration. Okay, so things can change, and I want to be very humble about the limitations of my knowledge. Okay, so first the good news. Look, with a lower population rate or even a falling population, it's much easier, for instance, to design policies that ensure the sustainability of natural resources. If you are thinking about issues like CO2 reduction, or you are thinking about issues like pressures on infrastructure, on housing, etc., well, maybe a few million people less in the planet may help quite a lot. In my particular example, and I know this is not an example that is directly applicable to you, and I know a little bit less about the areas under your purview, but since I care a lot about Latin America, this is my favorite photo of Latin America. It's a neighborhood on Brazil, and if anyone ever had a visual representation of what income inequality means, this is the one. You can see on one hand a beautiful apartment building with their own pool in every apartment, in every terrace, and then a very nice collective room, and then you just on the other side of the wall, well, not so nice. Now, Latin American cities grew very, very fast during the 1960s and 1970s to accommodate the enormous increase in population in these countries. Maybe if population starts going down in Brazil, in Argentina, or even in Mexico or Central American countries, it's a good moment where we can try to go back and try to redesign these cities and make everyone more livable. And in addition to it, as I was mentioning before, even if all these countries are already below replacement rate, because of momentum, many of these countries still have enough time to undertake a lot of essential reforms that will prepare them for this future a little bit better. So, not everything is bad, and we can take advantage of this population reduction for the good of everyone. But there are also bad news. And the bad news is what I often call the unpleasant arithmetic of demographics. And this is my favorite way to explain it. Think about a basic accounting identity, okay? So output is just labor productivity multiplied by labor. Nothing very deep over here. Then you can take logs and differentiate with respect to time. Output growth is just equal to labor productivity growth plus labor growth, okay? Well, let's think about the US, the way we were, like in the famous movie, around 2000. You have that labor productivity growth is around 2%. This has been a relatively constant rate of productivity growth in the US since the end of the Civil War in 1865 until today, sometimes a bit higher, sometimes a bit lower, but 2% is a good benchmark to keep in mind. And then we have a 1% labor growth. Okay? Around half of this labor growth came from immigrants, people like me with funny accents, and another half of it come from the fact that American fertility was relatively high. And that gives you a 3% output growth. That means that in a normal year, you grow 3%. When the economy is doing a little bit better, for instance, unemployment is falling and labor is growing faster than average, you grow 4%. When things are not so well, you grow 2%. But you kind of fluctuate around this 2%. What happens when we fast forward to 2050, when labor growth in the US will be falling at around -1%. And of course, this depends on the policies we take on immigration. So let me just assume similar levels of immigration that we had at the beginning of the 2000s, not like the ones we had during the Biden administration. And basically what you are going to be is in a situation where in a typical year you will grow 1%. So labor productivity will still grow 2%. By the way, this is an optimistic assumption. We can try to come back to that later on and try to think if it makes sense or not. But labor growth is falling at around 1%. So in a normal year, you grow 1%. When you are doing a little bit better, you grow at a 2%. When you are doing a little bit worse, you are growing at a 0%. And the point is, there is absolutely nothing that the Fed can do about this. Okay, you can write as many papers as you want as expansionary fiscal policy, as many papers as you want about lowering the interest rates. These are the fundamentals of the economy. You are going to be growing at a 1% on average. Now, is this an unrealistic scenario, something I cook up? No, it is actually not. And what I'm going to tell you is a paper, a very, very quick summary of a paper that I brought with Gustavo Ventura, my good friend, and Wen Yao, one of my former students. And it's called The Wealth of Working Nations. And this paper came about after what you here in England will call an refreshingly honest discussion with another macroeconomist about the origins of the problems of Japan. And this other macroeconomist thought it was about monetary policy, and I thought it was not, so I decided I may as well write a paper about it. Japan has been the poster child of lackluster economic performance since 1991. We even have words like Japanization, and Pesek in 2014 wrote a book that made much to popularize that term that refers to Japan not growing, Japan being stagnated, and as you can see over there, he basically attributes all these problems of Japan to some structural problems of the Japanese economy. So what we did was the following. First of all, we are going to download the data for the G7 plus Spain. Why plus Spain, where there is the official answer and the unofficial one. The official answer is because Spain is the 8th largest economy of the advanced economy, so we make the G7 a little bit larger. The unofficial one is I'm Spaniard and I'm interested. Okay, so we are going to look at 1991 to 2019. Why we start in 1991? Because before 1991, demographics didn't really matter. Okay? All these countries were growing relatively at a steady pace. The big drop in fertility starts in Japan in the 1970s, in Germany in the 1980s, in the rest of the world in the late 1980s, of the G7 plus Spain. So before 1991, it doesn't really matter. Why 2019? Because we didn't want to contaminate the sample with COVID and the possible endogenous responses of COVID. The paper is already published. I guess that if I were going to redo these calculations now, I will also add to 2024, because by now the economies have recovered from COVID and it doesn't really matter. First row, GDP. And I selected in red Japan and the US. This is what you will read in the Wall Street Journal. This is the typical story of the, second-rate economist who pretends he's very wise because he has a column in the Financial Times. And you see that in the US is 2.58% a year, in Japan is 0.83. And then you talk about the stagnation, fiscal policy, the zero lower bound, and keep filling column after column, week after week. And then you have Spain, the UK, and Canada roughly at a little bit around 2, and then France and Germany a little bit worse, and then Italy. Okay, I will come back to Italy in a second because Italy is always the most depressing case. Yeah, I always joke that the role of Italy in life is make me feel less bad about Spain when I look at data. Then you look at GDP per capita. And what do you see in GDP per capita? You already see that the big difference of growth between Japan and the US becomes much smaller. Becomes 163 in the US versus 0.76 in Japan. Why? Because population in Japan at the bottom of the graph, at the bottom of the table, has been growing only 0.08 a year, while in the US 0.94. As I told you before, roughly half because of immigration, roughly half because of higher fertility in the US. But that's not the whole story. Because as you age, what you are going to have is a lot of older people. So population may still be growing, or it may not drop a lot, but there are people who are in their 70s, in the 80s, in the 90s. They are not in any meaningful way part of the labor force that could contribute to the country. Now, the problem is, how do we measure that? How do we measure some sense of the amount of people working in a country? We do it in 3 different ways. Actually, in the paper, in the appendix, we do it in a few more, and you always get the same answer. So don't get too worried about the details. But the first one is we are going to look at GDP growth per working age adult. People between 15 to 64, this is the standard definition of working age by statistical agencies. And basically what we say is this gives us a sense of how many people we have in that age group. And look at what you see. You see that now the US is 1.65 and Japan is only 1.39. So the difference is not that much. It's a little bit, the US has been doing a little bit better, but not tremendously better. But even more, imagine that I drop from the sample the years 1991 to 1998, where Japan was still recovering from the asset price bubble and its burst. Now, we don't do that in the paper, only in a footnote, because we don't want to oversell our point. But if you do that, since 1999, Japan has actually been growing faster than the US in per working age adult. So I don't see absolutely anything that suggests in the data that Japan is stagnated. Japan, there's just fewer Japanese. Now, you can say, oh, but there is a lot of older people in Japan working. I noticed when I went to Japan, a lot of older people in supermarkets working. And yes, but remember, the participation rate in Japan was already very high for older people in 1991. So this is a level effect. But nonetheless, we look at participation rates, or we redefine population between 15 to 69, and nothing changes. And we do a lot of other exercises. It's very hard to push after 70 just because there is not enough data. We kind of do some imputations. We also take younger people that may be in college. You basically always get the same thing. Now you say, well, this is the total amount of adults, but what about the hours that you actually work? Now, I like that less, but we got that question every single seminar we gave and in every single referee report. So we also added per hour work, you actually get exactly the same answer. The only country for which this doesn't make any difference is Italy. Italy always does bad. Okay, so Italy really has been stagnated. But there is not much explanation for Japan that is needed. And basically my argument, or the argument in our paper, is that the present of Japan, or the experience of Japan of the last 20 years, is likely to be the experience of many other countries as population aging and population drop matters. Now, a lot of you are thinking, but what do I care about total growth? Don't we care about output per capita? And the answer is yes and no. So yes, of course, output per capita is a very useful measure of individual welfare, but there are a lot of things that do not depend on output per capita. For instance, our ability to service debt or the social security obligations depends on total output. So if total output is not growing, we are going to be in a more difficult situation. Second, you need to tax. And this is something that I guess that in the next iteration of the papers I'm going to write about this, I want to highlight more. If output per capita is still doing okay, but it's being produced by a smaller and smaller share of the population, you really need to tax that smaller share of the population a lot to take it to the other age part of the population, which is going to create tremendous distortions. Something that we, for instance, already see in Spain. If you want it, I can tell you some data about that. And that's something that people kind of forget about it. And then, of course, the big elephant in the room is labor productivity still going to grow at a 2% a year? So I was taking that as some type of constant, and the answer is maybe no. And the reason for that has to do with two issues. First, with firm dynamism, and second, with new technologies. So one of my favorite papers on this topic is from Hugo Hoppenheim and a couple of co-authors in Econometrica, just came out very recently. And what Hugo does with his usual enormous elegance is to answer the following question. There is much less firm dynamism in the US, and you can summarize that by the share of firms age 11 or higher. And actually, you can see a big decrease in the entry rate. Why is this the case? Is because now young people are less dynamic, are less entrepreneurial? The answer is no. So actually, the percentage of young people who are entrepreneurs and who create new firms is exactly the same that over the last few decades. There are just fewer of them. And because there are fewer of them, you have fewer new firms. Okay? So a lot of technological adoption and technological innovation done by young firms is not going to exist just because there are going to be fewer young firms. So 2% unlikely to be something that we can keep in the long run. Now, there is also, of course, the arguments of ideas are getting harder to reach. This is, from Nick Bloom and his co-authors, and they basically say, look, we are having more and more researchers, and yet their productivity is falling down just because we probably ran out of all easy ideas to figure it out. May artificial intelligence help a little bit with this? Yes, but what I have tried to argue on repeated occasions is that any type of likely advantage that we are going to get from artificial intelligence, and I love artificial intelligence. Look, I actually do teach machine learning for economists. That's my main teaching. This is in some senses kind of a side gig. Machine learning is not going to be able to such a dramatic way overcome the forces of demographics. So those who think that machine learning will solve everything, I think they are being overly optimistic. So no, I don't think that a 2% is going to be the case. And in that situation, my new normal of 1% may actually be over-optimistic, and that we may be in a new normal of 0%. And with a new normal of 0%, we are going to be on a tough spot. Now, reaching this point, I always have one person in the room. I always get three questions. The first question is about what artificial intelligence. I just replied to that. The second question is about what immigrants. Well, that's a little bit trickier than it seems. And it's a little bit trickier than it seems because, as I was mentioning before, net immigration into Earth is 0. So yes, Spain may be able to handle the demographic shock better than other countries because we are importing hundreds of thousands of Colombians, but that makes population in Colombia worse off. Okay, so what is a gain for our country is a loss for another one, and sometimes I find that sometimes economists are a little bit selfish about how they think about these issues from their own, rich country perspective. But the point is, and I actually have been doing research on that, we live on a welfare state. Okay, and there are many ways to value the contributions of migrants to an economy, and I'm very open about that. I'm an immigrant myself. But something that we need to remember is that when you're living in a country with a welfare state, if you come and you are below the 70th percentile in the income distribution, over your life cycle, you're probably going to be a net drawer from the welfare state. Yes, when you work, you are going to pay payroll taxes and you're going to pay VAT, but when you retire, you are going to get social security payments and you are going to get health care payments. And I actually have done some numbers for Spain, and I know other people have been doing other numbers for other countries. If you are below 70%, you are a net loss for the welfare state. Now, I'm not saying that we should value immigrants as, investment assets. I'm just saying, If your argument is, oh, we are going to fix all this by bringing immigrants, I'm just saying that argument is flawed. That's the only thing I'm saying, okay? And by the way, the amount of immigrants that you will need to bring will be absolutely incredible. So for instance, in the case of South Korea, ethnic Koreans will need to go up. They are now around 99% of the population to be a little bit less than 20% of the population. There is no society that can undertake that change in ethnic composition in a generation and a half and don't blow up. So what we can do, very, very quickly, since I only have 1 minute and 40 seconds left, I think that a lot of the current drop in TFR is driven by the extensive margin, not by the intensive margin. But by that, I mean a lot of it is people not getting married and people not having kids. And that in that particular situation, you know, giving someone £5,000 as a tax break is not going to make any difference. From all my thinking about this, and that actually, I think, aligns very nicely with Gianni's presentation this morning, the two levers that we have that will really make a difference is cheaper housing. Substantially cheaper housing will really, really make a difference, but also more convenient housing in terms of size of the house, in terms of transportation. There is much higher fertility when you live in the suburbs than when you live in the center city, even controlling for the endogeneity of the location. It's just very difficult. My brother lives in Brooklyn. How is he going to have many kids living in Brooklyn? It's just not possible. Also, I have been very critical of a lot of the modern city planning, and because I think it's deeply anti-families and anti-kids, and changes in education. I really think that at this moment, we may be over-educating a generation of people. I was making the point this morning, look, you are getting people who are now 4 years of college, 2 years of pre-doc, 7 years of PhD, 2 years of postdoc. You know, by the time you are ready to have kids, you are 35, and we have already seen how difficult it is to get pregnant after 35. Let me wrap up. We are really moving in a completely different world than anything that we have seen before. And the only thing I want you to remember is this is a world where actually being middle income may mean you have lower fertility than higher income countries. And there is a good chance that in fact by the year 2050 to 2060, the US may be the country with the highest fertility rate in the world. And I don't think anyone has really started thinking about that. Thank you.
Questions, reactions? Yes, please.
Thank you, Jesús. This is really nice. One quick question. I mean, one counterfactual example to Japan would be South Korea.
Yeah.
They didn't experience the same recession as Japan did, but they have been shrinking for a while in the same pattern as Japan did. So, do you have anything to say about that?
Yes, it's just that the fertility in Korea fall much later than in Japan. So basically what we try to argue in the paper is that this is what is in the store for for South Korea in like 10 or 15 years. So again, all these things, the really interesting thing about demographics is that you have these very long lags. And sometimes you need to think about what happened 20 years later. So yes, South Korea, I really think they're going to be in a very, very tough spot. Now, they may be able to sustain higher productivity growth at Japan, and that may be linked to some problems of the Japanese economy. But I don't foresee a very brilliant future for Japan. I have another paper called The Neoclassical Growth of China. We do that for China. And we basically argue with Chinese demographics. China is not going to do very well in 2035. And, you know, good luck sustaining your political system with that situation.
Yes, please. Let's go around and collect a few questions,
of course,
and then Jesús will take them all.
And got in touch with the organizers so I could come and listen to this. Because I think it's remarkable, the work, certainly for someone outside the field. I'm a journalist. But my question was going to be, what are the realistic versions of the graphs you showed for total fertility rate for those countries? Because you were sort of mocking the UN projections. As far as I could tell, you didn't actually have your own version of what the UN projection line should look like. So I was just interested in what you think a lot of these countries like South Korea and so forth, where they're heading with their TFR. And finally, the labor growth figure you have is -1%, but could it be a lot worse than that? Thank you.
Beata?
So Thank you very much for an excellent lecture. So you are worried about labor supply as the constraint. A few days ago, I listened to a lecture by Anton Korinek, who said, well, that's no longer right a constraint, because in 5 years we are going to have artificial intelligence, you know, this new type of general artificial intelligence, so that AI and robots will take care of all the economically valuable tasks. So that's the other end of the spectrum. Now, presumably, the truth is somewhere in between. So could you tell us a bit more about AI, other than just, you know, productivity of researchers?
Thank you. Yes, please.
I have just a clarifying question about when you say about the UN data being wrong, that there's mismeasurement error, is it about birth rates being wrong or death rates being wrong? Because I can imagine, right, the total population is both.
So thank you so much for the presentation. I was wondering if you could say a little bit about the delay in childbearing, because I think this is also something that you hear, that maybe there's just kind of a bit of a temporary push to later, and that could create very fast falling for a few years and then recover.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Thank you. I was wondering, how do you think about the political economy of this? Because, you know, you presented it as a local problem for every country, but also as a global one. It makes me think of other problems that have the same nature. Think, I don't know, climate change, for example. What exactly do you have in mind when it comes to the solution for this?
Any other questions? Then I had a small question. That table actually explains a lot of productivity puzzle everywhere from Japan to the UK, but not really in Italy. What explains it in Italy? Any thoughts on that?
I think that I'm a little bit more convinced about how to forecast India, which is a big chunk of the world. I think that India is going to follow China. So, and the reason I think that will be the case is because I think that the north of India is following what happened with the south of India 10, 15 years ago. And in fact, the south of India has been following what happened with Indians living outside India, for instance, in Malaysia 10 years before. So I think I can make a good graph for India, where India will be at around 1.3, 1.2 before long. And that will dramatically change the thing. Same for the Middle East and North Africa. The problem where it's a little bit harder to forecast is countries like South Korea, because we've never been in a situation where it's 0.72. So what I'm just trying to say is, well, maybe something you can do is just assume as forecast that wherever we are, we stay over there. And to me, it's the only kind of sensible solution. Or everything else is just, you know, kind of this rebound. We just have never seen that, period. Okay, so, or at least be more explicit about it. And unfortunately, the United Nations World Projection is, if you try to look at the methodology, they are trying their very best to make this a secret. You are saying labor can fall even farther and faster than 1%? Of course. I'm just trying to make, I don't want to oversell my case. So that's why I'm taking a little bit of that. Korinek, I have a little bit of a different view than Anton on artificial intelligence and general artificial intelligence. I think that, if anything, we're already seeing a slowdown in the growth of artificial intelligence over the last year or so. Artificial intelligence is becoming, of course, much easier to use, but in terms of really the breakthroughs, I don't think they are quite there anymore. So that when I teach artificial intelligence to my grad students, I always tell that artificial intelligence kind of goes on leaps and stagnation, and I think we just had a big leap with large language models and the transformer architecture. And I think that we are going to get a little bit stuck over there. I truly don't think we are going to have a robot that can clean my bathroom in the next 10 years. I just don't think it's going to happen. And the main problem that my father has, who now has quite limited mobility, is how to clean his bathroom. And I don't see any way we are going to be able to fix that in the short run. United Nations, fantasy accounting. Most of the fantasy comes in birth. Death rate, there is a little bit less fantasy, but there is a little bit more. Sorry, a little bit less. But basically it's with births. Births just do not make any sense whatsoever. Total fertility rate, we are not computing it well. Fully agree with you. Actually, as I was mentioning before, total fertility rate is the synthetic thing, and it's computed with kind of a standard methodology from the early 1960s. I'm actually working with Patrick also on trying to explain why that methodology is actually flawed when you are observing very fast changes. And it's one of those things, it's one of those little dirty secrets in demographics that people never really pay attention of how this is computed, and it actually makes a big difference. And that may change our view of the world. Also, another view of the world where it may change is if actually population is lower than we think in countries like Colombia, actually fertility rate is higher. So it kind of goes in the other direction. And that may be part of the reason why we are seeing such a very, very fast drop in fertility in these countries. The political economy, that's poisonous. It's absolutely poisonous. We are going to be in a situation where you are going to have that the median voter is going to be 68 years old, that the median voter doesn't want to change anything whatsoever because après moi le déluge, and how are we going to introduce any type of reforms? Now, as you are saying, in addition to it, there is this global aspect to it where countries may actually end up fighting for workers, or maybe not, or taking different situations. It's kind of hard to forecast. And finally, about Italy, there are so many things wrong with Italy. Sorry, I brought this. I brought this paper with Vincenzo Quadrini and Leo Henian on Italy, and basically in Italy what you see is this enormous amount of barriers to growth and these enormous regional differences that do not seem to be shrinking at all, and that's, I think, what is behind Italy. So I'm not claiming that all the cross-country variation in growth rates is due to demographics, but I'm claiming that a lot of it is due to demographics. And, you know, Italy is an example of where demographics is part of the story, but it's not all the story. A lot of other things are about Italy.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. On this optimistic note, I think we can close the future of humanity. Thank you to everyone who stayed with us until the end of the main program of day one. Tomorrow, sessions resume at 9:30. There should be coffee here outside from 9 o'clock. And those who are invited to the drinks, I think there is an address there. But if anyone is invited and they don't know where to go, please find Javat or myself or Roca, and we'll let you know. Thank you very much.